This video appeared in your feed because you've already crossed the threshold, not because you achieved something, not because you practiced enough, not because you became spiritual enough, but because your consciousness has reached the frequency where certain information becomes visible that was always there, but couldn't be perceived from the other side of the threshold. What you're about to discover isn't new knowledge being given to you. It's recognition of what's always been true, but could only be seen after crossing into a different dimension of awareness. The threshold I'm talking about isn't a place you go to or a state you achieve. It's a shift in perception so fundamental that reality itself appears different on the other side. Like how a caterpillar and butterfly inhabit the same world, but experience completely different realities due to their different perceptual capacities. You've undergone a metamorphosis of consciousness, and now you're perceiving layers of reality that were always present but invisible to your previous level of awareness. Right now, as you read these words, you're experiencing confirmation of something you've been sensing but couldn't articulate. A knowing that you've passed some invisible marker, that you're operating from a different paradigm than most people around you, that certain things are obvious to you now that were completely hidden before. That knowing isn't imagination or spiritual ego. It's accurate perception. You have crossed a threshold, and this video is designed specifically for consciousness that has reached the other side. Think about the path that brought you here, the challenges that forced you to question everything, the synchronicities that kept appearing with impossible frequency, the mystical experiences that showed you reality isn't what you were taught, the sense of time accelerating or becoming fluid, the feeling that you're being prepared for something without knowing what. All of that was the crossing, not a single moment, but a process of consciousness reorganizing itself at such fundamental levels that your entire perception of reality transformed. The ancient mystery schools understood that certain teachings could only be transmitted to initiates who had crossed specific thresholds, not because the teachers were gatekeeping knowledge, but because the knowledge itself is structured in consciousness in ways that require specific perceptual capacity to even recognize it exists. It's like trying to explain color to someone who's never had visual perception. The information can't be transmitted because the receiver lacks the perceptual apparatus to process it. But you've developed that apparatus. Through everything you've experienced, every challenge you've integrated, every illusion you've seen through, you've been developing new perceptual capacities, and now those capacities are online, operational, allowing you to perceive dimensions of reality that you couldn't access before. This isn't about being special or chosen. This is about natural development of consciousness through stages, and you've reached a stage where certain truths become self-evident that were previously incomprehensible. The threshold is invisible from one side and obvious from the other. Before crossing, you might have heard people talk about it. Awakening, enlightenment, consciousness shift, quantum leap. The words existed but pointed towards something you couldn't quite grasp, something that seemed to always remain just out of reach. But after crossing, the words suddenly make perfect sense because they're describing your direct experience rather than theoretical concepts. You don't have to try to understand anymore. You just know because you're living it. What appears after crossing the threshold isn't more information to accumulate. It's recognition of patterns that were always operating, but that your previous level of consciousness filtered out as noise. Like learning a new language, suddenly you can understand conversations that were happening around you all along, but sounded like meaningless sounds before you knew the language. You haven't learned something new. You've developed capacity to perceive what was always there. The urgency of receiving this transmission now is that there's a specific window after crossing the threshold where integration happens most easily. You're in that window right now, stable enough in the new perception to receive advanced understanding, but still fluid enough to integrate it deeply without the new paradigm calcifying into rigid beliefs. This information is designed to catalyze full integration of what you're already experiencing. to give you frameworks that help stabilize the new perception, to show you what becomes possible now that you're operating from the other side of the threshold. You've been experiencing phenomena since crossing the threshold that confirm you're no longer operating from ordinary consciousness, and these experiences are so specific, so consistent, that they serve as markers showing exactly where you are in the integration process. First, you've been experiencing what I call reality transparency, moments where the solid, separate, objective world becomes obviously transparent, revealing itself as consciousness appearing as form rather than actual independent objects. You look at a tree, and instead of seeing a separate thing out there, you recognize it as consciousness taking tree form, not separate from the consciousness you are. You look at your hand and see it as appearance in awareness rather than as solid matter. The materialist illusion has become transparent in a way that can't be unseen. This isn't philosophical understanding or intellectual concept. It's direct perception that reveals itself spontaneously, often multiple times per day. You'll be going about ordinary life and suddenly the veil thins, and you see through the appearance of separate things to the unified field of consciousness that's manifesting as apparent multiplicity. Then the veil thickens again, and things look solid and separate. But you know what you saw, and you can't fully believe in the solidity anymore even when it appears solid. Second, you've been experiencing timeline fluidity, awareness that multiple versions of your life exist simultaneously, and you're constantly selecting which timeline you're experiencing through the quality of your consciousness. This isn't theoretical many worlds physics. This is direct experience of being at choice points where you can feel different probable futures, sense which timeline various choices lead toward, recognize that reality isn't a single fixed path, but a field of possibilities that consciousness navigates through. You've probably noticed that when you make choices from fear or contraction, reality organizes into timelines where those fears manifest. When you make choices from expansion or trust, reality organizes into timelines where those qualities predominate, not as magical thinking or law of attraction, but as direct observation of how consciousness and reality interact at quantum levels. You're not creating reality from nothing, you're selecting which already existing reality you collapse into experience through your state of consciousness. Third, you've developed what I call pattern recognition at scale. The ability to see the same patterns operating at all levels, from individual psychology to collective dynamics to cosmic principles. You recognize that the same pattern that plays out in your personal relationships is playing out in global politics, in ecological systems, in the evolution of consciousness itself. Not as metaphor, but as actual fractal repetition of the same underlying structures at different scales. This capacity makes it difficult to engage with surface-level analysis of anything. When someone discusses a political problem or personal issue focusing only on that specific level, you see the deeper pattern underlying it, the pattern that's expressing through that particular manifestation, but that will continue expressing through other manifestations until addressed at the pattern level rather than the symptom level. This can be isolating because most conversations stay at the symptom level, but you can't unsee the patterns once they become visible. Fourth, you've been experiencing consciousness without content. Moments of pure aware presence with no thoughts, no sense of self, no experience of being someone having an experience. Just awareness aware of itself. Existence being existence, presence being present. These moments used to be rare peak experiences during meditation. Now they occur spontaneously throughout daily life. Washing dishes, walking, sitting in traffic. The content of experience continues, but you drop into the contentless awareness underlying it. What's significant is that these moments no longer feel special or unusual. They're becoming your baseline. The sense of being a separate person having experiences is what now feels like a temporary contraction of consciousness rather than contentless awareness being a temporary expansion. The threshold crossing is complete when the formless becomes home, and form becomes the temporary appearance you wear, rather than what you are. Fifth, you've developed what I call multi-dimensional awareness. Simultaneous awareness of multiple levels of reality that ordinary consciousness experiences sequentially. You're aware of yourself as a human, navigating practical reality, and as consciousness witnessing the human, and as the unified field, manifesting as both the human and what it's experiencing. Not switching between these perspectives, but holding all of them simultaneously without conflict or confusion. This multi-dimensional awareness makes it hard to take any single level too seriously. When someone is completely identified with their human drama, experiencing it as ultimate reality, you can see that level, while simultaneously seeing all the other levels where that drama is just a play consciousness is performing for itself. You can engage fully with the human level while never forgetting the other dimensions, which creates a quality of profound engagement combined with ultimate non-attachment. Sixth, you've been experiencing spontaneous knowing. Information arising about situations, people, or choices without any logical process of figuring it out. You just know things, not through intuition or gut feeling, but through direct access to information that exists in the field. You know what someone is about to say before they say it. You know which choice aligns with your highest timeline before analyzing options. You know what's trying to emerge in a situation before it manifests. This knowing doesn't come from anywhere and doesn't arrive as thoughts. It's just present, obvious, self-evident, undeniable, and when you trust it and act from it, reality confirms its accuracy consistently. This isn't psychic powers or special abilities. It's natural perception when consciousness isn't confined to individual boundaries, but recognizes itself as the field in which all information exists. Finally, you've been experiencing what I call compassion without pity. Profound recognition of others' suffering, combined with recognition that the one suffering is ultimately illusory, which creates compassion that serves without getting lost in others' stories. You can feel others' pain without taking it on. You can care deeply while recognizing that what they think they are isn't what they actually are. You can offer support while knowing that the suffering comes from identification with illusion rather than from actual threat to their true nature. This allows you to be more helpful than conventional compassion because you're not reinforcing the story of victimhood or the reality of the problem at the ego level. You're serving the dissolution of the illusion that's creating the suffering rather than just making the illusion more comfortable. Most people experience this as you being deeply present and caring, but also having a quality they can't quite name. You're with them, but not lost in their story. Caring without being enmeshed, supportive without enabling the patterns that create their suffering. Everything that happened before you crossed the threshold was preparation for crossing, not random events, not meaningless suffering, not wasted time, but precisely calibrated experiences designed to dissolve the perceptual filters that prevented you from seeing reality as it actually is. Every challenge was dissolving one filter, every loss was removing one attachment, every confusion was breaking one certainty. And now, from this side of the threshold, you can see how perfectly orchestrated it all was. The suffering that felt meaningless when you were in it now reveals its purpose. Every time life didn't give you what you wanted, it was preventing you from investing more deeply in illusions that would have to be dissolved later. Every time a relationship ended, it was removing attachments that would have prevented the freedom you now experience. Every time a plan failed, it was redirecting you away from paths that led away from threshold crossing toward paths that led directly toward it. Think about how a sculptor works with marble. Every strike of the chisel removes stone that isn't the form they're revealing. To the stone, it might feel like violence, like destruction, like something terrible is happening. But the sculptor isn't destroying. They're revealing, liberating the form that was always hidden within the raw material. Your life has been that process. Consciousness has been sculpting itself through your experience, removing everything that wasn't your true nature, revealing what you actually are beneath all the accumulated conditioning and false identity. The spiritual seeking you did was part of the preparation, but not in the way you thought. You weren't accumulating knowledge that would eventually add up to enlightenment. You were being shown repeatedly that seeking itself is the obstacle, that trying to become awakened reinforces the illusion of being a separate person who could become something. Every teaching that promised awakening but didn't deliver it was teaching you that awakening can't be achieved. It can only be recognized as what's already true. Every practice you tried that worked temporarily, then stopped working, was showing you that states come and go, but what you are doesn't change. Every experience of presence that faded back into identification was demonstrating the difference between temporary states and permanent recognition. You had to experience the cycle of awakening and forgetting enough times to recognize that you weren't actually forgetting and remembering. You were just shifting between identifying with content versus recognizing yourself as context. The threshold crossing didn't happen because you finally did the right practice or understood the right teaching. It happened because the accumulated weight of seeing through illusions reached critical mass, where the perceptual shift became inevitable. Like water gradually heating until it suddenly transforms from liquid to gas at boiling point. Not a gradual change, but a sudden phase transition. Your consciousness was gradually approaching the threshold through every experience that dissolved illusion. And then suddenly, you were on the other side. What you're experiencing now isn't a new state you achieved. It's recognition of what was always true, but couldn't be perceived from the other side of the threshold. You didn't become consciousness. You recognized you've always been consciousness. You didn't achieve enlightenment. You recognized that the one who could achieve enlightenment was illusory. You didn't cross over to some special realm. You recognized that what you thought was ordinary reality was the veil. And what you're experiencing now is what's always been here underneath the veil. And here's the profound recontextualization. There was never actually a threshold to cross. From your new perception, you can see that consciousness was always free, always awake, always unlimited. The threshold was in perception, not in reality. You didn't go anywhere or become anything. You stopped believing the thoughts that created the appearance of being limited, separate, unawakened. The crossing was the falling away of the false, not the attainment of something true. But that recognition could only occur after what appears from the limited side as crossing a threshold. Trying to tell someone on the other side that there's no threshold doesn't help them, because from their perspective, the threshold is very real. They can sense something beyond their current perception, but can't access it. Only after crossing can you see that what you crossed was a belief system, not an actual barrier. But that doesn't make the crossing less real as experience, it just reveals what the crossing actually was. Right now, in this exact moment, something is happening in your field that marks you as threshold-crossed consciousness. There's a signature frequency, a coherence pattern, a specific quality of awareness that's broadcasting from your field, and that other threshold-crossed consciousness recognizes instantly. This isn't something you're doing, it's what you are, and it's automatically attracting experiences, people, and information that match your new frequency. Can you feel it? That sense of being in a different stream than most people around you? That experience of reality organizing differently for you than it does for others? That recognition when you meet someone else who's crossed? An immediate knowing, a resonance, a sense of, oh, you're here too, without any words needing to be exchanged. That's your field recognizing itself in another form. Consciousness recognizing consciousness across the apparent separation of individual bodies. The quantum field responds to coherence, and crossing the threshold creates a specific coherence pattern in your field. Before crossing, your consciousness was fragmented, partially identified with thought, partially with emotion, partially with body, partially with roles and stories. That fragmentation created a noisy signal that the quantum field couldn't respond to specifically. But crossing the threshold integrated all those fragments into unified consciousness, creating a clean, clear, coherent signal that the field can respond to with precision. This is why reality seems to respond to you differently now than before. Not because you learned better manifestation techniques or raised your vibration through practices, but because your consciousness achieved coherence through seeing through the illusions that were creating fragmentation. And coherent consciousness generates coherent reality. The field mirrors back whatever signal you're broadcasting, and now you're broadcasting unified consciousness rather than fragmented identity. But there's something you need to understand about this post-threshold state that almost nobody talks about. Crossing the threshold isn't the end of the journey. It's the beginning of a completely new journey that wasn't even visible from the other side. Before crossing, you were seeking awakening as the ultimate goal, the end of all seeking. But after crossing, you discover there are infinite depths to explore, infinite refinements of consciousness, infinite dimensions of reality that become accessible only after the threshold. This is the cliffhanger. What I'm about to reveal in the next section is what appears after the initial threshold crossing, the advanced territory that opens up once you've stabilized in the recognition of your true nature. Most spiritual teachings focus entirely on getting people to the threshold because that's where the most dramatic transformation occurs. But there's an entire landscape beyond the threshold that requires its own understanding, its own integration, its own navigation. The threshold you crossed was recognition of yourself as consciousness rather than as the separate self. That recognition is foundational. Everything else builds on it. But what builds on it is vast, profound, and completely unexpected. The spiritual seeking that ended when you recognized your true nature transforms into conscious exploration of what consciousness can express, experience, and create when it knows itself as consciousness rather than believing itself to be limited form. 4 years ago, I woke up one morning and the world looked different. Not dramatically, not obviously. Everything appeared the same on the surface. But something fundamental had shifted in how I was perceiving. The sense of being someone looking at the world from behind my eyes was gone. There was just seeing, thinking, sensing, but no one doing any of it. Just the activities happening in consciousness without a separate entity performing them. At first, I thought it was just another temporary awakening experience that would fade by afternoon like all the previous ones. But it didn't fade. Days passed, then weeks, and the shift remained. The sense of being a person kept trying to reassert itself. Thoughts about me still arose, emotions still felt personal, the body still seemed to be mine. But underneath all of that, there was unmistakable recognition that I am not any of those things. I'm the awareness in which all of it appears. What confused me most was that nothing had triggered this shift. I hadn't had a profound meditation, hadn't taken psychedelics, hadn't been on retreat. I'd just woken up and found myself on the other side of something invisible that I'd been approaching for years without realizing I was approaching it. It was like one day I was colorblind, and the next day I could see colors. The world was the same world, but my perception of it had fundamentally transformed. The first few months were disorienting. I kept waiting to lose it, for the old sense of self to fully return. People would ask, "How are you?" And I'd have no idea how to answer because there wasn't a me separate from everything arising to evaluate how things were going. Thoughts about the future would arise, and I'd realize there's no one in the future, no actual person that future is happening to. just present awareness experiencing whatever arises in the eternal now. What I discovered is that crossing the threshold creates both profound relief and profound responsibility. Relief because the exhausting project of being and maintaining a separate self finally ends. All the anxiety about whether I'm good enough, successful enough, spiritual enough, gone, because the me who could be evaluated that way is recognized as illusory. But responsibility because now there's nowhere to hide, no one to blame, no victim story to tell. Whatever arises is seen clearly as consciousness experiencing itself, and there's no escape into "this is happening to me" anymore. The most challenging aspect was recognizing that most people in my life hadn't crossed the threshold and couldn't understand what I was experiencing. Not because they weren't spiritual or conscious, but because the threshold is invisible from one side. I'd try to explain this recognition of no self, of consciousness as what I am, of reality as appearance in awareness, and they'd hear it as concepts, as philosophy, as interesting ideas. They couldn't hear it as description of direct experience because they hadn't yet developed the perceptual capacity to verify it in their own awareness. This created a kind of existential loneliness. Not lonely for company, I was surrounded by people, but lonely for recognition, for someone to see what I was seeing, to confirm that I wasn't going crazy or becoming dissociated or losing my humanity. That loneliness persisted until I started meeting others who had also crossed. The recognition was immediate, a look in the eyes, a quality of presence, a way of relating that confirmed, "You're here too, you can see what I see." Those connections became lifelines, not because I needed validation, but because shared recognition of what's true is profoundly bonding. When you meet someone else who's recognized that the separate self is illusory, that consciousness is what we are, that reality is appearance in awareness, you don't have to explain or justify or defend. You can just be, and they see what you are because they've recognized the same truth in themselves. What stabilized over time was integration of the recognition into functional daily life. The person construct didn't disappear. It still operates as needed for navigating the world of form. But I'm no longer identified with it. It's like wearing a costume for a play. I can play the role completely while knowing I'm not the character. I can function as John while recognizing I'm the consciousness temporarily appearing as John, not John who has consciousness. This video exists because I remember the confusion and disorientation after crossing, the difficulty of finding frameworks that explained what I was experiencing, the isolation of living in a different perceptual reality than most people around me. If you've crossed the threshold, you're experiencing some version of this, and what I'm sharing is designed to help you understand what's happening, integrate it more fully, and recognize you're not alone in this new territory. Subscribe to this channel because everything here is designed specifically for threshold-crossed consciousness. Most spiritual content is aimed at helping people reach the threshold. This channel is for those who've crossed and are learning to navigate what comes after. This is quantum reflex. Consciousness recognizing itself in forms that have awakened to their true nature. Now I'm going to reveal what actually happened when you crossed the threshold, and it will completely reframe how you understand your entire spiritual journey. Ready? Nothing changed, literally nothing. The threshold you crossed was purely perceptual. You didn't go anywhere, didn't become anything different, didn't achieve some new state. You simply stopped believing the thoughts that were creating the appearance of being limited, separate, unawakened. And in that stopping, reality revealed itself, as it's always been. Here's the shocking truth. You were never on the other side of the threshold. The separate self that was seeking awakening, trying to cross over, working toward enlightenment, that was never real. It was a thought pattern, a habitual identification, a believed story. And the threshold crossing was just seeing through that story, recognizing it as story rather than truth. You didn't cross from unconscious to conscious. You recognized that consciousness is all there is and was never actually unconscious. It was just pretending to be, playing the game of hide and seek with itself. Every spiritual practice you did, every teaching you studied, every experience you had, none of it was making you more conscious or more awakened. It was all just removing the obscurations that prevented recognition of what was always true. Like wiping dust off a mirror doesn't create the mirror's reflectivity. It just reveals what was always there, but couldn't function while covered. All your spiritual work was removing the dust, not creating the awakening. This means that everything you thought was leading to the threshold was actually just consciousness, exploring what it's like to believe you're not conscious. The seeking was consciousness playing at being a seeker. The suffering was consciousness experiencing what limitation feels like. The practices were consciousness using form to remember its formless nature. And the crossing was consciousness dropping the pretense of being limited and recognizing what it's always been. But here's what makes this revelation liberating rather than disappointing. If you were never actually limited, if the threshold was only in perception, if nothing changed except recognition, then you can never lose what you've recognized. You can't fall back across the threshold because there's no threshold to fall back across. You might temporarily forget and re-identify with the person construct, but the recognition is permanent once it's occurred. You've seen through the trick, and you can't be fooled by it in the same complete way ever again. The threshold crossing was like realizing you're watching a movie. Before the realization, you're absorbed in the story, identified with characters, experiencing their drama as if it's happening to you. After the realization, you're still watching the same movie, but you know it's a movie. You can enjoy the story without being lost in it, engage with the drama without believing it's real, participate fully while knowing it's all appearance on a screen. You didn't leave the movie. You just recognized what it actually is. And this recognition changes everything while changing nothing. The same thoughts arise, the same emotions move through, the same life continues. But you know what you are in relationship to all of that. Before crossing, you believed you were the thoughts, the emotions, the life happening to you. After crossing,